Hello everyone. Welcome to the 5th video lesson about the gay 90s. This is the last section of ladies' wear that we'll look at in chapter 14, and this is the very last decade of the 1800s, referred to as La Belle Époque, or the gay 90s period. Several silhouette things are very important in this period, but the biggest thing is that we have no more bustles. The silhouette is going to change to be much softer on the bottom, but the significant thing about the gay 90s, and the thing that makes it the most recognizable, are the sleeves in this time period. So let's move along and see what I'm talking about. Okay, let's start with the ladies' clothes from the skin out. In this decade, we are still having ladies wear a chemise and underdrawers, although there's also something called a combination, which was a chemise and drawers that were put into one piece that you would step into and not have to have a waistband. There's a corset, changes shapes a little bit in this time period to accommodate a silhouette that's a little different. And the corset cover is going to still be around, but sometimes be called a camisole, and we still have that term in a garment similar to this around today. We don't have a bustle pad per se. However, there may be a little pillow-like structure worn at the back to just help support some of the fullness in these skirts. Lots of these skirts have fullness in the back, gathers or pleats in center back to make the train or the back of the skirt be very nice and wide and full. So sometimes a pillow would be worn back there to support all that fabric. They would wear a couple of petticoats, but no underproppers like a bustle. And the undergarments in this time period are particularly lovely. I mean, you can still find some of these things in antique stores today, and they have what we call today heirloom sewing techniques on them, with pin tucking and double needle stitching and lots of lace and embroidery and things like that, and they're actually really pretty. Here's an ad for what was referred to as reform underwear. I'm going to talk at the end of this lecture about the reform movement in dress, but this is a fun picture of a lady in what looks like a lady's version of long johns, and that's kind of what a combination was, but this is considered much more comfortable and practical, and I thought it was interesting. You can also see what a lady's corset might look like of the poor lady who's forced to wear a corset sitting on the couch. Here's what a corset looks like in this time period, and they didn't usually have shoulder straps, although you'll probably find some that do. The shape is very similar to what we had in the bustle period, but it's not quite as long, and it's very curvy. This idea of an hourglass silhouette is going to come back. Remember that from the Romantic period? Well, it's going to come back. And interesting enough, the Romantic period also had a big emphasis on not only hourglass, but significant sleeves, and we're going to see that again here. You can see how this corset might support an hourglass silhouette. And there's also this, which I think is pretty fun, bust improvers. The ideal lady had a significant bosom in this time period, and the clothes were designed to kind of accentuate the chest in many of these dresses. And if you didn't have your own, you could buy these to fill out your own figure. They could be made out of celluloid, which is almost like, reinforced fabric, almost like a plastic. Or they could be wire framed, and the ones on the top right look like they're almost like a corset that had wires casings in it. Or padded like little pillows, and then they would stuff them with cotton or whatever and stick them inside the corset to fill out the front of your bodice, because you wouldn't want to look flat. And then here is this is not a drawing, this is a photograph of a pad. If you can imagine this, you can just barely see the string. It would be tied around the waist, and then this little portion would be in the back. And it's just a little pillow-like quilted thing to help support the skirts in the rear. So, the silhouette is hourglass once again. We're going to have really significant sleeves in this time period. That's the way you identify it, both during the day and for evening wear. And what happens is we're going to have immensely large sleeves that are going to decline in volume as we go through this 10 years. And by the time we hit 1900, they've reduced significantly. The waist, the preferred waist, was a very small waistline, and many women did extraneous measures to try and have a very small waist, even up to and including having their floating ribs removed, which is just abominable to us today. However, the idea of being this willowy, matronly on top, but nice and skinny at the waist, woman was, well, the pressures were high for fashion, and some women would tight corset significantly, and you can understand probably why there would be a sub-movement of women who were opposed to these kinds of practices that they considered very unhealthy, and we're going to see something called a dress reform movement really come to the forefront. It started back earlier than this. It started back in the crinoline period, but it's going to be more prevalent, and more people are going to adhere to it in this time period. And then we've got skirts to complete the hourglass. We've got skirts that flare out in kind of a bell shape. Let's talk about day dresses in this decade. The bodices themselves could be boned to keep the wrinkles from showing and to keep them shaped the way the ladies wanted. They were quite tight fitting, ended at the waist, and there could be a little bit of a point or a rounded front at center front. Some of these bodices look a lot like jackets to me, and they might have little short peplums or basques, basques being the tabbed version of a little peplum. And they might also have things that look like lapels, revers, right? Lapels on these jackets, or yokes, or things to make the shoulders look even broader. And you'll see what I mean. Here is a bodice from this time period with significant sleeves. And you can see in this beautiful bodice of jacquard silk that there is like an asymmetrical idea of one side has a lapel. But this also shows you the center front point, going to a point in center front. One thing I would like you to notice is where the waistline is on this bodice. Whenever you are constructing or analyzing a period garment, that's one of the first things you need to look at. In this bodice, I see a bodice that comes below, just a tidge below the natural waistline. Can you see how it flares out just a bit on the top of the hips, and then it dips to center front? So knowing that kind of information when you are trying to create a period garment is very important, because sometimes you think things are at the waistline and they may not be. Let's look at some of the other garments. Here is a beautiful silk embroidered jacket and a little vest, and you can see this one also has lapels, and it has a little peplum skirt attached at the waistline, and which flares out into like a little skirt below the waistline. Now this one looks like it does have the seam at the true waistline. But boy, aren't those some sleeves? And here is a fashion illustration. This jacket also has lapels, and then these wide collar top of the sleeve thingies, and then a flared, ruffled looking peplum. So let's talk about the sleeves. These sleeves are leg of mutton style, and there could be construction differences in how they are constructed. We studied this in the Romantic period with the gigot and the demi-gigot sleeves, which are everything that comes from the top of the sleeve and tapers down to the wrist, or things that are in two sections where we have a big puff to the elbow and then straight from the elbow to the wrist. Both of them are going to just be referred to as leg of mutton sleeves. This is the leg of mutton sleeve, period. And the significant thing that I want you to know is they get really huge by mid-decade, and then they're going to start to gradually recede in fullness until we get to the year 1900. And when we get past 97, most of the sleeves will be much, much, much smaller and just have a little bit of a kick up at the shoulder. Some of these sleeves also have little interest things inserted into the shoulder seam, like an epaulette or a little shoulder wing or some kind of ruffle or something. So there's lots of different variations. Here is a drawing showing a fabulous leg of mutton sleeves, which is in the style, kind of the demi-gigot style, with the big puff at the top and then slim from the elbow down. And this also has some kind of an interesting thing inserted in the top of it, a little ruffly thing. Here it is a picture of a woman wearing the actual dress to the left. And this has a little bit of lovely lace inserted into the sleeve. And you can see these are, again, that demi-gigot style. And if you look at the bodice itself, can you see how that doesn't end directly at the waist? It goes a little bit lower. So many of these ones that were worn on the outside, like bodices, not necessarily like jackets, could have that extended waistline. Here's a beautiful dress from the mid part of the decade with satin and velvet. Really interesting dress. Can you also notice that these daytime dresses have higher collars, most of them? Let's go back and look at this, ladies. She has a higher collar. This has a higher collar. We're covering the chest. We're covering the neck as well. And here is an illustration that shows the lady in green to the left has a jacket, right, and a skirt. And the lady in the pink floral, that is a blouse, or what we're going to call a shirtwaist and a skirt. And here again is another more jacket and skirt style. So as we get closer to the year 1900, you can see here how this is what happens. They start to deflate. It's if they take the helium out of their sleeves, and they get much, much closer form to the arm. And all of these, from 1897 and 1898, you can see there's just a little bit of a puff of the sleeve, and then it's relatively slim all the way down the arm. You can also see how the hourglass silhouette is still there, especially on the drawing in the center. It's still there, but it's not as extreme because the sleeves aren't as extreme. The skirts during this decade are gored skirts. We're not going to gather all the way around because the idea was to accentuate that thin waist. So they would put fullness in the back and have some pleats or whatever, but they're going to be gored or cut and shaped so that the hem circumference can be nice and wide and bell-shaped, but it's nice and slim around the waist. If you had to do a job, your skirt would probably not hit the ground because you need to be able to move. And if you are doing some kind of sports activity, those skirts also would most likely be off the ground. So let's talk about this option now. In addition to just bodices and things that look like jacket bodices, we also have the option of wearing a blouse or a shirtwaist, which was abbreviatedly called a waist. And these are basically blouses that were worn with skirts. And there's a lot of different styles of these as well. They could be very, very, very fancy out of wonderful, fine, expensive, embroidered or whatever fabric, or they could be very simple and plain and made out of cotton. They could be man-tailored, very plain, like a man's shirt almost, or they could be very, very frilly, lots of stuff, gorp and frou-frou all over it, but they all had high collars up around the neck, and they all displayed the same kind of sleeves that are in fashion during this time, the leg of mutton sleeves. And these blouses or shirtwaists were some of the very first things that were actually mass-produced in clothing factories in America. And you could order all different kinds of these through Sears, Roebuck, Montgomery Ward's, what have you, catalog very easily. Here's a few examples of existing ones in museums. And you can see the one on the left looks like it's just a plain pink floral calico kind of a fabric with a little bit of a lace yoke, or not lace actually, it's a ruffled yoke on top of it. The one in the center is more austere, it's kind of a gray. Has you can see how there is fullness over the bust though. These are going to either be cut really wide and then gathered in, sometimes with a drawstring at the waistline so that there are full pleat kind of tucks over the bosom, or they're constructed that way. And the one on the top right has a nice frilly jabot like ruffle going down the center front, but all of these have very full sleeves. And here are some examples of how a woman might wear one of these shirtwaists with different kinds of skirts. Most often they would have some sort of a belt, or what I call like a little fabric cummerbund kind of thing that a lady would wear over the intersection of where the blouse would stick inside the skirt. They would cover that with something attractive like a fancy belt or a fabric cummerbund. I think you can see that in both of these. And when we get to the end of the decade again, the sleeves on the shirtwaist will also reduce, like the sleeves on the regular bodices. The sleeve puffs go down. And here's a catalog. This is an illustration from the ladies' magazine, The Delineator, that shows these shirtwaists with much reduced sleeves. And they're all unique, and they all are lovely. And then there's something called a tailor-made costume. And tailor-made is basically the idea of having a lady's suit, a jacket and a skirt that match, that is worn with a shirtwaist. And they're called tailor-mades because the patterning was so simple. I think we talked about this briefly in the bustle section. They started out being made by men's tailors because they were very similar. And then they just start referring these as tailor-mades, which just use the substitution ladies' suit. Okay, they could be very severe like men's suits and very plain, or they could be quite fancy. And here's a lovely plaid one down in the bottom on the right, plaid jacket-like bodice with a plaid skirt. Here are some other ones, and you can see these can be very elaborate, but they can also be very plain. This one on the left is quite elaborate. The one on the right is a little bit more austere. But they contain the big old leg of mutton sleeves and the hourglass silhouette no matter what. And here, if you look at the woman on the far left is wearing a shirtwaist and a skirt, but all the other ladies in this diagram on this slide are all wearing tailor-mades, and they're all a little different. The one right, what I would call number 2 from the left, hers looks a lot like a man's suit. She even has like a bow tie collar. But the other ones on the other section are quite much more feminine and fancy. And here's something I also found very interesting. Oftentimes, a woman would buy a couple different kinds of bodices to go with the same skirt. And these look like they could belong together. Different kind of a bodice. Maybe one is for going outside, going visiting, and the other one is more of a shirtwaist style. Right? Can you see? Tucked in, and then a lovely turquoise cummerbund belt to hide the intersection of shirtwaist and skirt. So let's look at some dresses. This is a Charles Worth creation from 1892. This is referred to as a reception dress. And again, there are all these different types of dresses for different types of day. So when you do research on this, know you're going to see all these different things called different names. And it would be important, should you design a show in this time period, to know what was the proper attire for these different kinds of activities. This one looks to me like a princess cut because I don't see any waistline seam, and it is not a definitive bodice and skirt. But do you see how it's been patterned in this lovely stripe? It's been patterned to go all the way down through the waist with no waistline seam. This is 1894. Lovely pink little frothy number. Another Worth afternoon dress. We see the back, but she's also being reflected in the mirror, which is a nice touch for the photographer. But big old sleeves. And do you see there's a little bit of fullness in her back and her posterior area, specifically because this dress has a train. There's more fabric that needs to be supported. Here's a reception gown from 1894. Big lace collar on this dress. This almost looks like a coat with a dress underneath it. 1895, I thought this one was lovely. I love the satin patterning of these leg of mutton sleeves and those kind of ruffled lapels on this. That's quite a striking gown. Here's an afternoon dress by Worth, and this lady is carrying this fabulous ostrich feather boa and a parasol. She looks like she could step right out of The Importance of Being Earnest. And here's an interesting one, a tea gown that has some Japanese inspiration. The sleeves are kind of kimono-like, and this is very different. As in the bustle period, there were tea gowns or gowns that were considered informal that you would wear at home, and this is one of those kind of dresses. It's not as form-fitting. It looks like a little more relaxed, and it's more of like a robe with a dress underneath. Here's an afternoon satin dress. Looks like a little short jacket with a shirtwaist underneath. And this is past mid-century. This lady is very forward-thinking. Her sleeves are not as gigunda. Here's a tea gown. Again, a dress that looks like it has a robe with it. This looks later in the 1890s. The sleeves are smaller. That's your telling point. How big are the sleeves? 1899, the sleeves are much, much reduced. And this is a relatively simple dress, much more middle class. So what do they wear in the evening? Well, we've got the same principles we've had before. Basically, in the evening, the sleeves may be reduced. We see more neck cleavage and or throat. We may see more arm. Until 1893, you've got lots of choices for what the neckline looks like in an evening gown. After 1893, the ones that are the most popular are things that are off the shoulder. And you could still have a very full top like of the leg of mutton sleeve, the puff part. And sometimes these are challenging to engineer to say, how do you keep that puff up if you're off the shoulder? And when we get to the late 90s, again, the same thing's going to happen to the evening gowns, that the sleeve size is going to reduce. Evening gowns are usually pastel, not always, but oftentimes pastel fabrics, more ethereal fabrics, or something very rich and luscious and beaded and velvet cut out, whatever. And oftentimes has trains. Here is a black one from 1894, and you can see that this has got black on top of what appears to be black velvet with some beading and applique, and we see the big leg of mutton sleeves that end more three-quarter length, and then this lady has white gloves and this fabulous dog collar of diamonds around her neck. Here are some designs for evening gowns as well, and you can see the one on the right is a Worth design with big frothy sleeves. And 1895, here's some sweet young thing evening gowns. These could be Cecily or Gwendolyn, and importance of being earnest if they were having an evening scene, which they don't. And here's an evening dress from 1894 with this fabulous, like, sunburst effect on it, designed by Charles Frederick Worth. And you can see this one has almost off the shoulder sleeves with puffs. And here's something for a more mature lady. This is later in the century. It has reduced sleeves. It's not too revealing, but it has that kind of darker velvet, or not velvet, lace collar business down the front. What do they wear outdoors? Well, like in the bustle period, they're going to have many choices of outdoor garments, and many of them will be shaped to go over these huge sleeves or to accommodate them by being cape-like, right? Oftentimes they would have high collars on them too. There were also overcoat type things that could be short, like to the hips, or long, almost to the floor. Ladies are still having the choice to wear the Chesterfield overcoat that would have the velvet collar, or an ulster that might have a belt. They all had to be fit over these big sleeves, and there are many, many, many variations, which we're not going to get into, but they're fascinating. Here's just a few for you. The drawing on the bottom is a coat, and the coat itself has the big leg of mutton sleeves. On the right, here's an existing one that is in a museum, and you can see the back is beautifully beaded and embroidered, and it has squared off sleeves to fit over the growing leg of mutton sleeves. Here is a satin evening coat that has huge big leg of mutton sleeves itself and a stand-up collar that appears to be either fur or feathers. I think it's feathers. And then there were beautiful things like this still. I mean, this kind of reminds me of what we saw in the bustle period. things that had fabulous embroidery and beading on them all by themselves. Okay, so sportswear is really a thing during this time period. And we're going to have specific costumes for ladies for specific sports activities, such as riding a bicycle. There was a cycling costume that was composed of bloomers. Sometimes they're called knickers. They're, you know what bloomers are. They go to the knee and they're full and puffy. That would be worn with a jacket. There were specific garments to wear when you go swimming that they called bathing costumes. And they're similar to what we saw in the bustle period, only they might have the great big leg of mutton sleeves attached. And this idea of ladies wearing knicker-like pants are also going to be adopted for things like mountain climbing and golf and hunting and things like that for very forward-thinking women. Not everybody would wear these because they were kind of controversial at first. But as sports become more of a thing that women are doing, they're going to become more movement friendly because the women will start to say, hey, I can't do the sport in this fashion. Let's adapt the fashion. And finally, people start listening to them. So here are some examples of swimsuits from the 1890s. These lovely wool outfits that have some sort of pants. Some of these have little skirts attached and short sleeves. And of course, you would wear stockings and specific shoes and a little hat to go with this. Here are some cycling costumes from the time period, and you can see how they have maintained the leg of mutton sleeve with these big poofy bloomers. The hair is really cool in the 1890s, and there's lots of variations on something that we refer to as a pompadour style. And that word pompadour actually comes from Madame de Pompadour in the 18th century, who wore her hair in a tighter version of this. It's basically like a bun up on the top of your head with some side curls and things. Well, in this time period, they have a bun on top of their head or on the back of the crown of their head, but it's not tight, it's loosened, and sometimes they would even put pads inside their hair to give their heads and their hairstyle more volume. And they refer to this pompadour style often as the Gibson girl look. Charles Dana Gibson was an American illustrator for many magazines, and he kind of created this ideal woman that was referred to as the Gibson girl. She had this upswept hairstyle. She had a very small, pouty mouth, a large bosom, small waist, wide hips, and she was kind of an ideal female. And his illustrations appeared in different publications, and there was kind of stories that went with her, that she was always being courted by the wrong kind of man, and she was looking for love, but she was kind of unattainable. There was a mystique about the Gibson girl. Here are some of his drawings that show the different hairstyles. Oh, and I see I've wrecked this slide. Well, sorry, but you can see that they were all, high up off the face, on the head, variations of this kind of pompadour style. And this is like the epitome of the Gibson girl. Hats in the 1890s were only worn outside, really, and they were small or medium-sized. They didn't have gigunda brims. When we get into the early 1900s, we're going to go to crazy hats for a while, but not yet. They might be plain. They might have tons of trim that would add height to them. They may have no brims at all or a little bit of a brim. And there's specific hats that go with different sportswear activities, like a boater for anything that's by the sea, or a fedora if you're going hunting and things like that. There's shoes and footwear. Well, stockings, of course, are always worn. In the daytime, cotton stockings were more popular, but you would wear fancy silk ones at night, and the idea of wearing black ones under your evening gown was really trendy. Rounded toes, medium-high heels, boots were also around, and they look a lot like what we saw in the last section in the bustle period. Here's just some interesting, this is ladies' leather boots during this time period. These are more utilitarian. This is what women would wear if they were going to work or being practical or doing sports. They would last longer. Accessories. Well, they're not that much different from the bustle period. Art Nouveau, however, is coming in. And an Art Nouveau is a fabulous new artistic style that is going to also have examples in fashion and jewelry, as well as interior decoration and wallpaper and art. Um, Things from nature that are done with curvy lines and very sinuous and sensual. So there's jewelry in this style that's going to be really popular for ladies. Watches that pin to their chest. Ladies are going to be wearing makeup, gloves outside, short ones during the day, long ones in the evening, boas we've seen of fur and feathers, different kinds of reticules and purses. Here is a silk robe with a dress. Let's talk about Art Nouveau style just really quickly. This comes from Europe, and it's an artistic reform movement that had some influence on what we study. This is an artistic style that tries to develop a style with something that's new. It's not redone. It's not going back to the classics or anything. It's a revolt against how the art of the Victorian period appeared to some of these artisans as being very eclectic. They wanted to start their own thing, and there was an emphasis on curved lines and taking forms from nature. And there was because of the curved lines and very sinuousness, there was a sense of movement in a lot of these things. Here are some examples of Art Nouveau motifs. These could be in wallpaper, in tile, on plates, paintings, whatever. But I think you can see there's a lot of floral things. We're also going to see insects, but it has a really wonderful characteristic. Here, Alphonse Mucha, if you've ever heard of that illustrator and artist, he was very prolific in this style. And as a matter of fact, there are several, but he's one of the ones you think of right off the bat. And he did a series of paintings of ladies in this style. And yeah, here's some more illustrations. There were several guys who did this, but it's very fascinating. Some of the ladies' dresses are going to reflect these influences of curved lines and nature forms and things that were a little more exotic. So we'll see embroidery on garments that follow this Art Nouveau style. We'll see fabric that's woven with patterns taken from this Art Nouveau style. We'll see lots of jewelry and purse handles and umbrella handles and hat pins and brooches and things that have this new Art Nouveau style. Here's a couple of examples just to show you what I mean. I love, it's kind of like a dragonfly pendant on the right, or angels or bugs or plants or nude women or butterflies, things like that. And they use a lot of gemstones other than the traditional ones, like moonstones and opals and things that aren't as, not diamonds and rubies and emeralds, but different things. So this Art Nouveau style is kind of like our transition style, going from the 1800s to the 1900s. And the idea that art is going to be something new, not a rehash of the past, is going to lead to what we know about art before and after World War I. Art's going to be a little different. And there's also some Oriental influence in some of these things. This is referred to as a Japanese iris-inspired dress. This is considered an Art Nouveau-influenced piece from the late 1890s. And then there's a couple other things that you need to know about. And these are, of course, dresses and styles that you could do huge research projects on. There's tons of stuff out there. But there's this thing called aesthetic dress. I mentioned the dress reform movement. There was actually a society called the Rational Dress Society. And it starts in England, and it's going to spread. These are women and some men, and particularly doctors, who were trying to reform these ideas of heavy corseting, heavy clothings that were not natural, some of their ideas are going to be reflected in artwork of the time period, because a lot of the women that were artists themselves or associated with artists wore this kind of reform style. And it's going to have some effect on high fashion and current, popular fashion. It's different from the bloomer movement, and it kind of starts with these artists that were called the Pre-Raphaelites. And these were a group of painters who opposed what was going on in art and start their own thing. And they would have their own wives or models dress in these garments that had a specific flowy, non-corseted, maybe with a little homage to the past look to them, or Asian or Japanese kind of thing. And this style is going to catch on, and we're going, especially for the people who are in the arts, their women might wear these things. This is some examples of Pre-Raphaelite paintings. This is Sleeping Beauty, and you can see it's very Greek-inspired. These are considered some works depicting models wearing what was called aesthetic dress. It's not recognizably 1890s. It's not recognizably anything. It looks like they take bits and pieces from different historical pieces and put them together, maybe with some emphasis on sleeves. Sometimes they would have leg of mutton sleeves, but not. But you can see these are not heavily corseted, or and this aesthetic movement, it's not just 1890s. It goes back a little ways. No bustles or things like that. These two costumes in particular kind of look Middle Ages, a little bit of Renaissance, long flowy, but they're definitely not cinched in and restrictive. Especially the one on the left, right? Or the right. They're pretty straight. Oscar Wilde was an aesthete himself, and he wore his own little costume. And I think those of you who are in costume design last semester, we talked a little bit about Oscar Wilde and his own style. He liked velvet jackets and knee breeches and cravats and stuff. And here's a couple pictures of Oscar wearing his own aesthetic dress, which was definitely not the mainstream style for guys, and so he kind of was a standout that way. And then there was something referred to as a Liberty costume. There was a clothing textile manufacturer and a fabulous department store called Liberties of London, and they were ones who made some of these dresses that were made to be worn without a corset. They might have the puffy leg of mutton sleeves, and they were made out of Liberty's own silks and cotton fabrics, and they were worn to be really straight. They didn't have a lot of poofing, pluffing. And the women who wore these appeared to the other people as being, very, very different. And it's contrasted definitely against the bustle stuff. And a lot of people made fun of these people for wearing stuff. These are two examples of what were called Liberty dresses. These were designed and made of Liberty fabrics during this time period. And you can see the one on the left definitely has some sort of a waistline. The one on the right doesn't. It looks almost Greek or Roman. And you can imagine if there was a street full of ladies wearing bustles and you saw somebody dressed in something like this, they would look radical. So this idea of dress reform is not just for the people who were artists or aesthetics. There was a general concern that women were damaging their bodies and not raising their children well by putting little girls in corsets as soon as they started to bloom. And then a lot of these styles just were not healthy. There's some fabulous writings by doctors of the time period coming out and railing against some of these garments. And you will also see in catalogs new garments that are referred to as reform this or Dr. So-and-so's, corset that was supposed to be more healthy for you. And finally, here is a painting by Whistler, a wonderful artist, of a woman wearing an aesthetic dress. We see the back of it, and it just looks simple and lovely. So we will stop there, and in the next video we'll look at men's dress during this entire chapter, 1870 through up to 1900. There aren't that many significant changes, and we'll talk about that in the next video.